I'm Marcus Thompson, 47, and for most of my adult life, my family saw me as the failure, the brother who never quite measured up, the son who couldn't hold down a real job, the black sheep who embarrassed them at family gatherings with his get-rich-quick schemes. They laughed when I moved into that cramped studio apartment, rolled their eyes when I talked about my investments, and whispered behind my back about how I'd never amount to anything. Last Thanksgiving, my sister Jennifer actually called me broke, in front of the entire family, her voice dripping with that familiar condescension I'd endured for decades. My mother nodded in agreement. My father just shook his head in disappointment. They had no idea that 3 months earlier, I'd quietly purchased the luxury apartment building where they all lived, thanks to a cryptocurrency investment that had made me wealthier than any of them could imagine. But what happened next would teach them that sometimes the family failure has the last laugh. To understand how we got here, you need to know about Jennifer and me. She's 3 years older, and from the moment I could walk, I was living in her shadow, while I was the kid who took apart radios to see how they worked. Jennifer was the strata student who never caused problems. When I started my first lemonade stand at age 8, trying to understand profit margins and customer service, my parents saw it as Marcus acting up again. When Jennifer joined the debate team, they called it leadership development. The pattern continued through high school. I remember flipping through my old yearbook last year, seeing the quote I'd written beneath my senior photo. Success isn't about following the path, it's about creating your own. I thought I was being profound. My family thought I was being pretentious. Jennifer's quote, of course, was about serving others through law, a noble sentiment that made my parents beam with pride, while Jennifer sailed through law school with family-funded support. I worked construction during the day and took computer programming classes at night. "Why can't you be more like your sister?" became my mother's favorite refrain. Jennifer bought her first car with money from Dad. I saved 4 months to buy a beat-up Honda Civic, which Jennifer once referred to as Marcus's jalopy at a family barbecue. The real betrayal came during my first serious business venture. I was 25, fresh out of a coding boot camp, and I'd developed a simple app that helped restaurants manage their inventory. It wasn't revolutionary, but local businesses were interested. I needed just $5,000 to properly launch it, money for servers, marketing, legal fees. I approached my parents for a loan, presenting a detailed business plan I'd spent weeks perfecting. My father looked at it for maybe 30 seconds before sliding it back across the kitchen table. "Marcus, you need to stop chasing these fantasies and get a real job. Jennifer's building a career. You're playing games." 2 months later, when Jennifer mentioned she wanted to redecorate her apartment, Dad handed her a check for $8,000. "For our successful daughter," he said, kissing her forehead. I watched my app idea get picked up by a competitor 6 months later. They made it profitable within a year. Jennifer used Dad's money to buy furniture she replaced 2 years later. That's when I realized my family would never see me as anything more than the disappointment. Jennifer was their investment, their source of pride, their proof that they'd raised a winner. I was the cautionary tale, the reminder of what happens when you don't follow the conventional path. But I was about to learn that sometimes the conventional path isn't the only one that leads to success. Sometimes the unconventional path leads to something much more powerful, the ability to rewrite the entire story. By 2015, I'd finally found some stability working at a tech startup called Dataflow Solutions. It wasn't glamorous, I was debugging code and maintaining servers, but it paid decent money and I was learning about emerging technologies. That's when I first heard about Bitcoin. My coworker Jake was obsessed with it. He'd spend lunch breaks explaining blockchain technology, mining algorithms, and the potential for decentralized currency. Most people thought he was crazy. Internet money, they called it, laughing at his enthusiasm, but something about it clicked for me. Maybe it was my lifelong fascination with systems that operated outside conventional rules, or maybe it was the rebellious part of me that had always felt like an outsider. I started researching everything I could find about cryptocurrency. I read white papers, joined forums, watched YouTube videos, until my eyes burned. The technology was elegant, revolutionary, and completely misunderstood by most people. It reminded me of the early days of the internet. Everyone thought it was a fad until it changed everything. The price of Bitcoin was hovering around $300 per coin. I had $5,000 in my savings account, money I'd been setting aside for another business venture. It represented months of careful budgeting, skipped dinners out, and weekend shifts. But something in my gut told me this was different from my previous investments. At Thanksgiving that year, I mentioned Bitcoin to my family. The reaction was predictable. "Marcus is playing with fake money now," Jennifer announced to the table, her lawyer's voice dripping with authority. "It's not backed by anything real." Dad shook his head. "Son, you need to put that money in a proper savings account, or maybe some blue-chip stocks. This internet currency thing is just another bubble." Mom patted my hand condescendingly. "Honey, you've always been drawn to these get-rich-quick schemes. Remember your app idea, your trading card business in college. You need to focus on building real wealth." But I'd already made my decision. The Monday after Thanksgiving, I bought my first Bitcoin, then another, and another. By Christmas, I owned 16 coins. The next few months were an emotional roller coaster. Bitcoin would spike to $400 and I'd feel vindicated, then crash to 200 and I'd question everything. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. checking prices on my phone, calculating gains and losses. Some nights I couldn't sleep at all. Jake left the company in early 2016, cashing out his Bitcoin to buy a car. I made a decent profit, he told me. You should probably do the same before the bubble bursts. But I held on. Something told me we were still in the early stages of something much bigger. While my family continued to see my Bitcoin investment as proof of my poor judgment, I quietly accumulated more coins whenever I had spare money. I ate ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches so I could buy fractions of Bitcoin. I canceled my cable subscription, walked to work instead of driving, and turned my thermostat down to save on heating bills. By the end of 2016, I owned 32 Bitcoin. The family still thought I was wasting my money on internet magic beans, as Jennifer liked to call them. They had no idea I was sitting on an asset that would soon change my life forever. In spring of 2017, Jennifer made an announcement that would unknowingly set the stage for everything that followed. She'd been promoted to senior associate at her law firm and decided to celebrate by moving to the most prestigious address in the city, Grandview Towers. I remember the family dinner where she described her new apartment with breathless excitement. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor, granite countertops, a doorman, and underground parking. The rent was $3,500 a month, which she mentioned with obvious pride. For Jennifer, the expensive rent wasn't a burden, it was a status symbol. It's where successful people live, she told us, scrolling through photos on her phone. The building has a waiting list, but my firm has connections. Mom and Dad were practically glowing with pride. Our daughter, living in luxury, Mom said, squeezing Jennifer's hand. You've worked so hard for this. Dad nodded approvingly. That's what happens when you make smart choices and build a real career. I felt the familiar sting of their implied criticism, but I congratulated Jennifer anyway. She deserved success. I'd never begrudged her that. What hurt was how my parents used her achievements as a weapon against my choices. 6 months later, Mom and Dad announced they were downsizing from their suburban house and moving into Grandview Towers as well. We want to be closer to Jennifer, Mom explained, and the building has such a nice community feel. Then Uncle Robert and Aunt Susan decided to move there after their divorce was finalized. Fresh start in a classy building, Robert said. Even my cousin Danny, Jennifer's age and a middle manager at an insurance company, managed to get a studio apartment on the 7th floor. Before I knew it, Grandview Towers had become the unofficial Thompson family compound. They'd gather for impromptu dinners, share building gossip, and coordinate their social lives around their shared address. When I visited for Jennifer's housewarming party, I felt like an outsider looking in on some exclusive club I'd never be invited to join. The building itself was impressive, I had to admit. Built in the 1990s during the city's development boom, it rose 22 stories above the harbor district. The lobby had marble floors, leather furniture, and abstract art that probably cost more than my annual salary. The doorman knew everyone by name, and the elevator was whisper quiet. Walking through those halls, seeing my family's names on the resident directory, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't just envy, it was a strange mixture of exclusion and determination. This building represented everything my family valued. Success, status, security. It was their proof that they'd made it, their shared symbol of achievement. I rode the elevator up to Jennifer's floor that night, listening to my family's laughter, echoing from her apartment, and I made a promise to myself. Someday, I would belong somewhere like this too. Someday, I would have something that commanded the same respect and admiration. I had no idea that someday would come sooner than I imagined, or that when it did, I wouldn't be seeking their approval anymore. I'd be in a position to give or withhold my own. In October 2017, just as Bitcoin was beginning its historic run toward $20,000, Dataflow Solutions ran out of funding. The startup had burned through its venture capital faster than expected, and our last-ditch effort to secure additional investment had failed. On a gray Tuesday morning, the entire development team was called into the conference room and handed termination letters. "We're grateful for your contributions," our CEO said, his voice hollow with defeat. "Unfortunately, we're unable to continue operations. Your final paychecks will include 2 weeks severance." I sat in my car in the parking lot afterward, staring at the pink slip in my hands. At 39 years old, I was unemployed again, with rent due in 2 weeks and a Bitcoin portfolio that had grown to over 40 coins, but was still too volatile to rely on for daily expenses. The family reaction was swift and predictable. I told them about the layoff at Sunday dinner. The "I told you so" energy was palpable. "These tech companies are all smoke and mirrors," Dad said, cutting his roast beef with surgical precision. "I've been telling you for years to find a stable job with benefits, government work, maybe, or join a union." Jennifer, resplendent in her success, offered what she thought was helpful advice. "Marcus, maybe this is a sign. You're almost 40. It's time to think about a more traditional career path. I could ask around at my firm. They might need someone in IT support." The suggestion stung more than she probably intended. IT support. After years of developing software and understanding complex systems, She saw me as qualified to reset passwords and troubleshoot printers. I appreciate the offer, I said carefully, but I'm going to look for another development position. Mom sighed dramatically. Honey, you've been chasing these computer jobs for years, and look where it's gotten you. Maybe it's time to consider something more stable. Uncle Robert, who had recently started dating a woman from the building, chimed in. There's dignity in honest work. Marcus, not everyone needs to be a hotshot entrepreneur. The irony was killing me while they were lecturing me about stability and honest work. My Bitcoin holdings had grown to over $600,000. The cryptocurrency was experiencing daily swings that represented more money than most of them made in a year. But I couldn't explain this without sounding like I was making excuses. So I nodded and accepted their concerned looks and patronizing advice. I took a part-time job at a computer repair shop to pay my bills while I looked for a real development position. Every morning I'd check my Bitcoin balance and feel a strange disconnect between my growing wealth and my family's perception of my failure. The temptation to cash out was enormous. $600,000 would solve all my immediate problems, buy me time to find the right job, maybe even put a down payment on a decent apartment, but something told me to hold on. The technology was still evolving, adoption was accelerating, and institutional investors were just beginning to take notice. While my family saw a middle-aged man struggling to find his place in the world, I was quietly becoming wealthier than any of them had ever imagined. The months after losing my job at Dataflow were some of the strangest of my life. By day, I was Marcus, the struggling tech worker, taking odd jobs and living paycheck to paycheck. By night, I was watching my cryptocurrency portfolio grow at a pace that defied logic. I kept a handwritten journal hidden in my desk drawer, tracking every Bitcoin purchase, every market movement, every moment of doubt or certainty. The pages were filled with calculations, price predictions, and emotional observations that I couldn't share with anyone. BTC hit $8,000 today, I wrote in November 2017. Portfolio now worth $1.2 million. Fixed Mrs. Patterson's computer for $1.50 this afternoon. Jennifer called to check if I need money for groceries. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. I'd repair computers for $20 an hour, while sitting on a fortune that grew larger each week. I'd listen to my family's concerned conversations about my unemployment situation, while mentally calculating that my Bitcoin gains from the previous day exceeded their monthly salaries. The family interventions became more frequent and more painful. They'd stage concerned discussions about my future, speaking about me in the third person while I sat right there. Marcus needs to face reality, Jennifer would say during these gatherings. He's been chasing these technology dreams for 20 years. Maybe it's time for him to consider a career change. Dad would nod gravely. I've been thinking the same thing. There's a position open at the Postal Service. Good benefits, steady pay. Marcus, you should consider it. Or he could go back to school, Mom would add. Get a teaching certificate. High schools always need computer teachers. They weren't trying to be cruel. In their minds, they were helping their struggling brother and son find a path to stability. They saw my part-time computer repair work as evidence of failure, not understanding that I was choosing low-stress employment specifically because I no longer needed to chase high-paying jobs. I started using my growing wealth to educate myself about real estate investment. I spent evenings reading about property management, financing structures, and market analysis. I took online courses about commercial real estate and studied successful investors. My family assumed I was job hunting when I spent hours on my laptop and still sending out resumes. Mom would ask when she called, something like that. I'd answer. While reading about cap rates and cash flow analysis. By early 2018, Bitcoin had reached its peak near $20,000 before beginning a dramatic correction. My portfolio, which had briefly touched $3.2 million, settled back to around $1.8 million as prices stabilized. The volatility that terrified most people had become my friend. I'd learned to buy during panics and hold during euphoria. But more importantly, I'd begun to see patterns in how assets were valued, how markets moved, and how real wealth was built and preserved. Cryptocurrency had given me capital, but it was also giving me an education in financial markets that no business school could provide. My family continued to see failure where I saw transformation. While they worried about my employment status, I was quietly becoming one of the most financially literate people they knew. While they offered advice about finding stability, I was learning to create it for myself. The gap between their perception and my reality was growing wider every day. Soon, it would become impossible to bridge. Thanksgiving 2018 was held at Jennifer's apartment in Grandview Towers. She'd volunteered to host, proud to show off her space to the extended family. The apartment looked like something from a magazine, perfectly decorated, spotlessly clean, with a dining table that could seat 12 people comfortably. I arrived carrying a bottle of wine, wearing my best shirt, and hoping for a peaceful family gathering. My Bitcoin portfolio had stabilized around $1.6 million after the market correction, and I'd been carefully researching real estate investments. I felt optimistic about my future, even if my family couldn't see it. The dinner conversation flowed predictably. Jennifer talked about her recent promotion to partner track. Danny discussed his new management role at the insurance company. Uncle Robert shared updates about his girlfriend Maria, who'd moved into the building 6 months ago. Everyone had success stories to share. When the conversation turned to me, the tone shifted. "So Marcus," Jennifer said, refilling her wine glass, "any luck with the job search?" "It's been over a year since Dataflow closed. I'm exploring different opportunities," I said carefully, taking time to figure out the right fit. Dad set down his fork with a slight clank. "Son, you can't explore forever. At some point you need to accept a position and start building toward retirement. You're 40 now. Actually 41. Jennifer corrected with a smile that wasn't entirely friendly. "Marcus, you know I worry about you. Living in that tiny studio apartment, working odd jobs. It's not sustainable." The conversation might have moved on if I hadn't made the mistake of mentioning my interest in real estate investment. "I've actually been studying property markets," I said. "There are some interesting opportunities developing." The table went quiet for a moment, then Jennifer laughed, not meanly, but with the indulgent tone you'd use with a child who'd just announced plans to become an astronaut. "Real estate investment," she repeated. "Marcus, you don't have any money to invest. You're living paycheck to paycheck doing computer repairs." "Well, I started." Asterisk, honey, Mom interrupted gently. "You've always had big dreams, and that's wonderful, but maybe focus on getting stable employment first. Then you can think about investments." Uncle Robert nodded knowingly. "Real estate takes serious capital, Marcus. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars just to get started. Maybe start with a savings account." I felt my face getting hot. "I understand the capital requirements. I've been researching with what money." Jennifer's voice had an edge now. "Marcus, I love you, but you need to be realistic. You're broke. You can barely afford rent on a studio apartment. Real estate investment is for people with actual wealth." Asterisk, she said the word broke with such casual certainty, such dismissive finality, that it hit me like a physical blow. Around the table, I saw nods of agreement. My parents, my uncle, my cousin, they all looked at me with that mixture of pity and frustration that I'd seen countless times before. Asterisk, but this time was different. This time, I had something they didn't know about. Asterisk, I excused myself to the bathroom and pulled out my phone, opening my cryptocurrency wallet app. The numbers on the screen showed exactly $1,647,382 in Bitcoin value. I took a screenshot, not sure why. Maybe I needed proof that their assessment of my life was completely wrong. When I returned to the table, the conversation had moved on to other topics, but Jennifer's word echoed in my head for the rest of the evening. Broke. They saw me as the family failure, the cautionary tale, the brother who never figured it out. What they didn't know was that the broke family member they were pitying had enough money to change all their lives. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to show them exactly how wrong they were. The Monday after Thanksgiving, I couldn't stop thinking about Jennifer's casual dismissal. "You're broke." The words had lodged themselves in my brain like a splinter. I'd spent years accepting my family's narrative about my life, but now I had the resources to write a different story. I started with a simple internet search. Grandview Towers, property information. Public records showed that the building was owned by Hartwell Properties, a real estate investment company based in Boston. I dug deeper, searching through property databases, city records, and business filings. What I discovered was fascinating. Grandview Towers had been struggling financially for the past 3 years. The building was only 78% occupied, well below the 92% threshold needed for profitability. Several large tenants had broken their leases early, and maintenance costs were higher than expected due to aging infrastructure. The more I researched, the clearer the picture became. Hartwell Properties had overleveraged themselves, buying multiple buildings during the peak of the real estate market. Now they were carrying too much debt on properties that weren't generating enough income. Industry publications mentioned Hartwell as one of several regional developers exploring strategic options for their portfolios. I'd spend the next week becoming an expert on Grandview Towers specifically. The building had 142 units across 22 floors. Average rent was $2,800 per month, which sounded impressive until you factored in the vacancy rate and maintenance costs. The property taxes alone were $1.2 million annually. Using my real estate education, I calculated that the building was probably worth around $18 million in the current market, significantly less than the $24 million Hartwell had paid for it. In 2015, for a company carrying heavy debt, this building was becoming a liability rather than an asset. Then I found the smoking gun. A trade publication article from 3 weeks earlier mentioning that Hartwell Properties was actively seeking buyers for select assets in the Northeast region to optimize portfolio performance. Grandview Towers was specifically listed among the properties being marketed. I stared at my computer screen, pieces of a plan forming in my mind. My Bitcoin portfolio was worth about $1.6 million, not enough to buy the building outright, but potentially enough for a significant down payment if I could structure the financing correctly. I called a real estate attorney I'd found through my research, A woman named Patricia Vance who specialized in commercial property transactions. I'm interested in purchasing a specific building, I told her during our consultation. It's currently owned by a company that appears motivated to sell. What would be the typical structure for a deal like this? Patricia explained the process. Most commercial real estate purchases involve 20 to 30% down payment, with the remainder financed through commercial mortgages. For an $18 million building, I'd need approximately $4 to $5 million down, plus closing costs. However, she added, if the seller is truly motivated and the building has occupancy challenges, they might consider owner financing or other creative structures to facilitate a sale. I left her office with a stack of documents about commercial real estate purchases and a growing sense of possibility. The building where my family lived, the symbol of their success and my exclusion, might actually be within my reach. But first, I needed to understand exactly how desperate Hartwell Properties was to sell, and I needed to figure out how to turn my cryptocurrency wealth into the kind of capital that could buy a 22-story building. The family that called me broke had no idea their failure was about to become their landlord. December 2018 was the month everything changed. I'd spend weeks researching Grandview Towers and developing a preliminary acquisition strategy, but I needed to convert my cryptocurrency holdings into traditional assets to make a serious offer. This meant facing the reality of my wealth for the first time. On a cold Tuesday morning, I walked into First National Bank wearing my best suit, the same one I'd worn 2 job interviews, and requested a meeting with a private wealth advisor. The receptionist looked skeptical when I explained I needed help managing a significant cryptocurrency portfolio, but she scheduled the appointment anyway. 3 days later, I sat across from David Chen, a polished wealth management professional who specialized in high-net-worth clients. I'd brought printed documentation of my Bitcoin holdings, transaction histories, and portfolio valuations. David's expression shifted as he reviewed my documents. Mr. Thompson, you're showing cryptocurrency holdings worth approximately $1.7 million. Is this information current? As of this morning, yes. He leaned back in his chair, reassessing me. 5 minutes earlier, I'd been another walk-in client, hoping to open a savings account. Now I was someone worth his full attention. If you're serious about diversifying these holdings into traditional assets, we should discuss a comprehensive wealth management strategy. This level of portfolio requires careful planning for tax implications, asset allocation, and long-term growth. Over the next 2 hours, David walked me through the process of converting cryptocurrency to cash, establishing investment accounts, and structuring my wealth for maximum flexibility. The bank could facilitate the conversion over several transactions to minimize market impact and tax consequences. Most importantly, he said, we'll need to establish you as a verified high-net-worth client, which opens access to private banking services, commercial lending, and investment opportunities typically reserved for our most significant clients. By the end of the meeting, I'd opened accounts that would allow me to liquidate my Bitcoin systematically and access the capital needed for real estate investment. David handed me his direct phone number and assured me that the bank would be eager to assist with any substantial acquisition opportunities I might pursue. Walking out of that bank, I felt a psychological shift that went beyond the financial transformation. For 41 years, I'd been Marcus the dreamer, Marcus the failure, Marcus who couldn't quite get his act together, but the person who'd just opened private banking accounts worth nearly $2 million was someone entirely different. That evening, I sat in my studio apartment's the same cramped space Jennifer had dismissed as proof of my inadequacy, and began converting my first portion of Bitcoin to cash. I watched as $200,000 in cryptocurrency became $200,000 in my bank account, then $400,000, then $600,000. By the end of the week, I had $1.2 million in liquid assets, with another $500,000 in Bitcoin I was holding as a strategic reserve. The numbers on my bank statement looked surreal, but they represented something more important than money. They represented power. The power to make choices instead of accepting circumstances. The power to act instead of react. The power to show my family exactly who I'd become while they weren't paying attention. I opened my laptop and began drafting an email to Hartwell Properties Commercial Sales Division. It was time to make an offer on Grandview Towers. The family that called me broke was about to discover that their biggest failure had quietly become their biggest threat. My first meeting with Hartwell Properties took place in a glass conference room on the 15th floor of a downtown office building. I'd established a shell company called Thompson Holdings, LLC to maintain anonymity. The last thing I needed was my family discovering my interest in their building before I was ready to reveal it. Richard Hartwell himself attended the meeting, which told me everything I needed to know about how motivated they were to sell. Successful real estate developers don't personally handle meetings with unknown buyers unless they're genuinely desperate. Mr. Thompson, he said, shaking my hand with the aggressive enthusiasm of a salesman, I understand you're interested in Grandview Towers. It's one of our premium properties, excellent location, solid tenant base, tremendous upside potential. I'd prepared for this conversation carefully. I've reviewed the property extensively. The location is excellent. but I'm concerned about the occupancy rate and cash flow metrics. My analysis suggests the building is underperforming relative to market standards. Richard's smile faltered slightly. He'd expected an eager buyer, not someone who'd done homework. Well, there are always fluctuations in occupancy, but the building has strong fundamentals. We're asking $19.5 million, which represents excellent value in today's market. I opened my portfolio and spread out printed analyses across the conference table. Based on comparable sales and income approaches, I'm seeing market value closer to $16 million. The building needs significant infrastructure updates, and the occupancy rate has been declining for 3 years. For the next hour, we went back and forth on valuation, financing terms, and contingencies. Richard was skilled at emphasizing the building's positives while deflecting concerns about its problems. But I could see the desperation in his eyes. Every time I mentioned walking away from the deal, Mr. Thompson, he finally said, "What exactly are you prepared to offer?" $14 million, with $3.5 million down in cellar. Financing for the remainder at 5.5% interest over 15 years. I'd also require a 60-day due diligence period and the right to inspect all tenant files and financial records. Richard almost choked on his coffee. $14 million? That's completely unrealistic. We have over $20 million invested in this property. But you don't have $20 million anymore, I said calmly. You have a building that's losing money every month and preventing you from pursuing more profitable opportunities. My offer provides immediate cash flow, relief, and a structured exit from an underperforming asset. I stood up and gathered my documents. This offer is good for 72 hours. After that, I'll be looking at other properties. The bluff was risky, but I'd done enough research to know that Hartwell was financially stretched. They needed this sale more than I needed this particular building. Richard called me 36 hours later. We're prepared to consider $15.5 million with your financing terms, but we need to close within 45 days. $15 million, 60-day due diligence, and I want right of first refusal if any current tenants break their leases early. Was a long pause. Deal. I hung up the phone and stared at the preliminary purchase agreement he'd email within the hour. In 60 days, if everything went according to plan, I would own the building where my entire family lived, the building that represented everything they thought I could never achieve, but more importantly, I would own the power to change the fundamental dynamic of our relationship, forever. February 15, 2019. The closing date I'd been anticipating for 2 months finally arrived. I sat in the law office of Patricia Vance, surrounded by stacks of documents that would transfer ownership of Grandview Towers from Hartwell Properties to Thompson Holdings, LLC. The due diligence period had revealed everything I'd suspected and more. The building's financial situation was worse than Richard had admitted. Several major tenants were behind on rent. The HVAC system needed replacement within 2 years, and there were ongoing disputes with the city about building code violations. But these problems actually worked in my favor. They justified my low purchase price and gave me leverage for future improvements. But Patricia reviewed each document methodically. Purchase price of $15 million, with $3.5 million down payment. Remainder financed through seller note at 5.5% over 15 years. Mr. Thompson, are you comfortable with these terms? Completely comfortable. Richard Hartwell sat across the conference table looking like a man who'd just sold his struggling business for less than he'd hoped, but more than he'd feared. He signed each document with resignation, occasionally glancing at me as if trying to figure out how a relatively young man with no obvious real estate background had outmaneuvered his experienced team. The wire transfer of $3.5 million from my account to the escrow company had been completed that morning. Seeing that much money leave my accounts felt surreal, but it represented less than half of my liquid assets. The cryptocurrency investment that my family had mocked for years was now purchasing the symbol of their success. And here's the deed transfer, Patricia said, sliding the final document toward me. Once you sign this, you'll be the legal owner of 142 residential units, 22 floors, and approximately 240,000 square feet of premium real estate. I signed my name with steady hands. Marcus Thompson, owner of Grandview Towers. Richard stood up immediately after the final signatures, clearly eager to leave. Good luck with the building, he said, shaking my hand. It's a solid property with good bones. I'm sure you'll do well with it. After he left, Patricia and I spent another hour reviewing my new responsibilities as a property owner. Insurance policies, management agreements, tenant rights, and legal obligations. She'd already helped me establish a relationship with Premier Property Management, a local company that would handle day-to-day operations while I learned the business. Congratulations, Mr. Thompson, she said as we finished. You're now officially a commercial real estate owner. What's your first priority? I thought about my family, probably finishing dinner in their apartments 20 minutes away, completely unaware that their landlord had just changed. I want to review every tenant file personally. I need to understand exactly who I'm now responsible for. That evening, I drove to Grandview Towers and stood in the lobby that I'd visited countless times as Jennifer's brother, but now I was looking at it through different eyes. The marble floors, the leather furniture, the abstract art all of it was mine. The doorman nodded politely. "Good evening, sir. Are you here to visit someone?" "Actually," I said, "I'm the new owner. I'll be around quite a bit." His expression shifted from polite indifference to respectful attention. "Welcome, Mr. Thompson. Please let me know if you need anything at all." For the first time in my adult life, I was looking at my family's world from a position of power rather than exclusion, and they had absolutely no idea what was coming. The week after closing, I met with Janet Morrison from Premier Property Management to review the transition plan. Janet was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd been managing residential properties for 20 years. She came highly recommended and had experience with buildings much larger than Grandview Towers. The previous ownership was hands-off, she explained diplomatically as we sat in the building's small management office. Hartwell Properties preferred to minimize expenses rather than address maintenance issues proactively. "There's some deferred maintenance we should discuss." She opened a thick binder containing tenant files, lease agreements, and maintenance requests. "We have 142 units, currently 109 occupied. Monthly rental income is approximately $285,000, but that's before we account for vacancies, late payments, and collection issues." I flipped through the tenant directory, looking for familiar names. There they were. Thompson, Jennifer, Unit 1847. Thompson, Robert and Susan, Units 1203 and 1204. Thompson, Daniel, Unit 712. Thompson, Margaret and James, Unit 1956. "I like to review the Thompson family files specifically," I said, trying to sound casual. Janet pulled the relevant folders. "Ah yes, we have several Thompsons in the building. They seem to be related. They often coordinate maintenance requests and social activities. Generally good tenants, though there have been a few minor issues." She opened Jennifer's file first. Jennifer Thompson, Unit 1847. Lease expires in August. She's been here 2 years, generally pays on time, though she's had some conflicts with neighbors about noise complaints from her dinner parties. Then my parents' file. James and Margaret Thompson, Unit 1956. They moved in 18 months ago. Very quiet tenants. No issues except they've requested numerous minor modifications to their unit without proper approval. Uncle Robert's file was more interesting. Robert Thompson, Unit 1203. His lease shows he's frequently late on rent, usually 5 to 7 days past due each month. And there's a note here about an unauthorized pet. Building policy strictly prohibits pets over 20 pounds, but neighbors have reported seeing a large dog in his unit. Danny's file contained the most significant issues. Daniel Thompson, Unit 712. Multiple noise complaints from neighbors about loud music and parties. He's also been cited twice for smoking in his unit, which violates building policy and city health codes. I studied each file carefully, noting lease terms, payment histories, and policy violations. What I discovered was that my family, who'd presented themselves as ideal tenants, deserving of their prestigious address, had actually been problematic residents in various ways. "Janet, what's the standard process for addressing lease violations?" "We typically issue written warnings first, then escalate to cure or quit notices if the problems continue. For serious violations or repeat offenses, we can begin eviction proceedings, but we prefer to work with tenants when possible." I nodded, making mental notes. "I'd like you to document all violations going forward very carefully, and I want to personally approve any lease renewals for the Thompson units." "Of course. Is there any particular reason you're focusing on these tenants?" I smiled. "Let's just say I have a personal interest in ensuring they understand the building's policies." "Clearly." Janet looked puzzled but nodded professionally. She had no idea she was working for someone who was about to give his family the most educational experience of their lives. 3 weeks into my ownership of Grandview Towers, I received my first opportunity to demonstrate how the new management would operate. Janet called me on a Tuesday morning with a situation that required immediate attention. "Mr. Thompson, we've received multiple complaints about a large dog in Unit 1203. The tenant claims it's a service animal, but we have no documentation on file, and the dog appears to be well over our 20-pound weight limit. Unit 1203. Uncle Robert. What's our policy on undocumented pets?" I asked. "The lease agreement specifically prohibits animals over 20 pounds without prior written approval. An additional security deposit. Service animals require proper certification. Without documentation, this constitutes a clear lease violation." I drove to Grandview Towers that afternoon and met with Janet in the management office. She showed me the complaints filed by neighbors in Units 1201 and 1205. Apparently, Uncle Robert's service dog was a 7-pound German Shepherd that barked frequently and had damaged the hallway carpet. "Has anyone spoken with Mr. Thompson about this?" "We sent a standard inquiry letter last week asking for service animal documentation. He responded by saying the dog is emotional support for his girlfriend Maria, but he hasn't provided any official paperwork." This was perfect. Uncle Robert, who'd lectured me about honest work and accepting reality, was flagrantly violating his lease agreement and lying about it. Janet, please prepare a formal lease violation notice. Give him 7 days to provide proper service, animal documentation, or remove the pet. Include photos of the carpet damage and copies of the neighbor complaints. Are you sure you want to take a hard line? He's been here over a year, and he might just need time to get the paperwork. I looked at her directly. Our building policies exist for a reason. If we allow one tenant to violate the lease without consequences, other tenants will expect the same flexibility. Mr. Thompson needs to follow the same rules as everyone else. The notice was hand-delivered to Uncle Robert's apartment on Thursday morning. I wasn't there to see his reaction, but Janet called me within 2 hours. Mr. Thompson just came to the office very upset. He wants to speak with the building owner. Directly he says there's been some kind of mistake and that he's a long-term tenant who deserves better treatment. What did you tell him? I explained that the building recently changed ownership and that the new owner is committed to strict enforcement of lease agreements. I told him all communication needs to go through our office. Perfect. What was his response? He demanded to know who the new owner is. When I refused to provide that information, he became quite agitated. He said he was going to contact his lawyer and that we'd be hearing from him soon. I almost laughed. Uncle Robert threatening legal action was rich, considering he was the one violating his lease agreement, but more importantly, his reaction told me everything I needed to know about how my family would respond to actual accountability. Janet, document everything he said. If he contacts a lawyer, refer them to our building attorney, and make sure he understands that the 7-day deadline is firm. Understood. Should I expect more pushback from him? Probably. But that's exactly why we need to establish clear boundaries from the beginning. Mr. Thompson is about to learn that the new ownership operates very differently than the previous management. By Friday evening, Uncle Robert still hadn't provided the required documentation. The countdown to consequences had officially begun. Sunday dinner at Jennifer's apartment had been a Thompson family tradition for months. This particular Sunday in March, I arrived knowing it would be the last one, where my family saw me as their disappointing relative rather than their landlord. The conversation started predictably. Jennifer was stressed about a big case, Mom was planning a spring garden for their balcony, and Dad was complaining about his golf game, but the tone shifted when Uncle Robert launched into his grievances about building management. You won't believe what's happening with the new owners, he said, stabbing his roast chicken aggressively. They're harassing me about my dog. Maria needs Rex for emotional support, and these new people are threatening eviction over paperwork. Jennifer looked up from her plate. Eviction? That seems extreme for a documentation issue. That's what I thought. The old management was reasonable. These new owners are corporate hardasses who don't care about long-term tenants. I've been here over a year. Dad shook his head sympathetically. It's always about money with these big companies. They buy buildings and squeeze out tenants to raise rents. Exactly, Robert continued. And they won't even tell me who the new owner is. Everything goes through this property management company. It's like dealing with a faceless corporation. I'd been quiet through this entire conversation, but now, I saw my opening. Uncle Robert, I said calmly, what exactly does your lease say about pets? He looked irritated by the question. It says no pets over 20 pounds without approval, but Rex is a service animal for Maria's anxiety. Do you have documentation proving Rex is a certified service animal? We're working on it. These things take time. How long have you had Rex? About 8 months. Look, Marcus, I don't need a lecture about lease agreements from someone who's never owned property. That was the moment I'd been waiting for. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a business card, placing it on the dining table where everyone could see it. The card read, Marcus Thompson, owner, Thompson Holdings, LLC. The table went completely silent. Jennifer picked up the card first, studying it with her lawyer's attention to detail. Thompson Holdings. Marcus, what is this? It's my business card. Thompson Holdings, LLC is the company that purchased Grandview Towers 6 weeks ago. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes. I could see each family member processing this information, trying to reconcile their image of broke, unemployed Marcus with the reality of Marcus who owned their building. Dad spoke first, his voice uncertain. Son, are you saying you bought this building? I'm saying I own this building. Uncle Robert, you've had 7 days to provide service animal documentation for Rex. Tomorrow is the deadline. If you can't provide proper certification, the dog will need to be removed or you'll face eviction proceedings. Jennifer's face had gone pale. Marcus, where did you get the money to buy a building? Cryptocurrency, I said simply. That fake internet money you've been mocking for 3 years. It's worth about $8 million now. Uncle Robert looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. You own my building. I own everyone's building. Jennifer, you're in Unit 1847. Mom and Dad, Unit 1956. Danny's in 712. I've reviewed all your files. The power dynamic in that room shifted so dramatically I could almost feel it. These people who'd spent years treating me like a failure were suddenly looking at me like I held their futures in my hands, which I realized I actually did. The aftermath? of my revelation was swift and predictable. Within 24 hours of Sunday dinner, my phone was buzzing with calls and texts from family members who suddenly wanted to have serious conversations about our relationships. Jennifer called first, her lawyer's training kicking in. Marcus, we need to talk about potential conflicts of interest. It's not appropriate for you to be making tenant decisions about family members. Why not? You didn't seem concerned about conflicts of interest when you called me broke in front of everyone. That's different. This is business. You could face legal challenges if you're seen as retaliating against family members. I'm not retaliating against anyone. I'm enforcing lease agreements equally. Uncle Robert violated building policy. The consequences would be the same regardless of who he is. Mom tried a different approach, calling that evening with her concerned mother. Voice, honey, this is all very confusing. How long have you been planning this? Why didn't you tell us you had money? Would it have mattered? 3 months ago, you were telling me to apply for a job at the post office. You thought I was a failure, who needed career counseling. We were trying to help. You were trying to fix me because you assumed I was broken. You never considered that maybe I knew something you didn't. Dad's call came Tuesday morning, direct and uncomfortable. Son, your uncle is very upset about this dog situation. Can't you make an exception for family? Dad, Uncle Robert has had 8 months to get proper documentation for his pet. He's been lying to building management about it being a service animal. Why should family members get special treatment for violating their leases? Because that's what families do. We help each other. Really? When did you help me when I needed startup money? When did you help me when I was unemployed? You helped Jennifer redecorate her apartment, but you couldn't help your son start a business. The silence on the other end told me everything I needed to know, but it was Uncle Robert's visit to the building management office on Wednesday that forced the real confrontation. Janet called me immediately afterward. Mr. Thompson, your uncle, came in very agitated. He demanded to speak with you directly, and became quite hostile when I refused. He accused you of buying the building specifically to harass your family. What exactly did he say? He said, and I quote, "That little bastard bought this place to get revenge on us. He's been planning this for months." He also said he wasn't going to be pushed around by his loser nephew who got lucky with computer money. The phrase loser nephew who got lucky crystallized everything perfectly. Even now, faced with undeniable evidence of my success, Robert couldn't acknowledge that I'd accomplished something significant. In his mind, I was still the family failure who'd stumbled into wealth through dumb luck. Janet, has he provided the service animal documentation? No. The deadline was yesterday. What would you like me to do? I thought about all the years of condescension, all the family gatherings where I'd been treated like the cautionary tale, all the times my accomplishments had been dismissed or ignored. Uncle Robert had called me a loser nephew. Jennifer had called me broke. My parents had treated my dreams like delusions. Now they wanted special treatment because we shared DNA. Issued the eviction notice. 30 days to cure the violation or vacate. And Janet? Document everything he said about harassment and revenge. If he's planning to cause problems, I want a record of his threats. Are you sure about this? Once we issue an eviction notice to a family member, this becomes very serious. I thought about the moment at Thanksgiving when Jennifer had dismissed me so casually, so completely. I thought about all the times my family had made me feel small, insignificant, and unsuccessful. I'm sure Mr. Robert Thompson is about to learn that actions have consequences, even for family members. The war I'd never wanted to fight was officially beginning. The eviction notice hit Uncle Robert like a sledgehammer. Within hours of Janet delivering the legal document, my phone exploded with family crisis calls that revealed exactly how my relatives planned to handle accountability. Jennifer called first, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. Marcus, this has gone too far. You can't evict Uncle Robert over a dog. This is vindictive and petty. It's not about the dog. It's about lying on legal documents and violating lease agreements. If Robert had been honest from the beginning and followed proper procedures, we wouldn't be here. But he's family. You're supposed to cut family some slack. Where was that family loyalty when you called me broke? When Dad refused to help with my business loan, when everyone spent years treating me like a failure? She went quiet for a moment. Those situations were different. No, they weren't. You all made decisions based on your judgment of my character and capabilities. Now I'm making decisions based on documented lease violations and tenant behavior. Mom tried emotional manipulation. Next, Marcus, honey, you're hurting the family. Uncle Robert is devastated. He feels betrayed by his own nephew. Mom, he called me a loser nephew who got lucky. He doesn't feel betrayed. He feels embarrassed at the family disappointment. That has power over him now. That's not true. We're all proud of your success. We just don't understand why you're being so harsh. You're proud now because you have to be. 6 months ago you were telling me to apply for government jobs because you thought I couldn't handle real responsibility. Dad attempted the business angle. Son, this looks bad for you professionally. Evicting family members makes you look vindictive. It could hurt your reputation as a property owner. Dad, my reputation as a property owner depends on enforcing Lease agreements consistently. If I give special treatment to family members, other tenants will expect the same flexibility. But the most revealing call came from Danny, my cousin who'd always been Jennifer's sidekick in family dynamics. Marcus, dude, what the hell? You can't just buy our building and start throwing people out? This is crazy. Danny, when's the last time you paid rent on time? Silence. I reviewed your file. You've been late 4 times in 6 months, and you've had multiple noise complaints. Should I ignore those violations too because we're cousins? That's totally different. I always pay, eventually, and the noise thing is blown out of proportion. It's not different. You signed a lease agreement. Either you follow it, or you face consequences. The family group text that Jennifer created became a fascinating window into their collective mindset. I'd been added to the chat, apparently so. They could coordinate their pressure campaign. Jennifer, we need to present a united front. Marcus is being unreasonable. Mom, I don't understand where this anger is coming from. We've always supported him. Dad, maybe we should suggest family counseling. This seems deeper than a business dispute. Uncle Robert, the kid's on a power trip. Someone needs to knock him down a peg. Danny, can we all just meet and figure this out? This is getting out of hand. Reading their messages, I realized they still didn't understand what had happened. They saw my actions as emotional retaliation rather than logical business decisions. They couldn't accept that the family member they'd dismissed for decades was now in a position to hold them accountable for their choices. But the most interesting development came from an unexpected source. 3 other tenants in the building approached Janet to express their gratitude. The Thompson family has been problematic for months. Mrs. Chen from Unit 1202 told Janet, the noise, the dog, the entitled attitude. It's refreshing to see management that actually enforces building policies. For the first time in my life, I was being praised for standing up to my family rather than criticized for disappointing them. 6 months after purchasing Grandview Towers, I sat in my new office reviewing the quarterly financial reports. The building was now operating at 94% occupancy, generating positive cash flow, and had become one of the most desirable residential properties in the district. More importantly, I'd learned lessons about family, power, and self-worth that no business school could have taught me. Uncle Robert had eventually moved out, choosing to break his lease rather than comply with pet policies. He found a smaller apartment across town that allowed large dogs, and though our relationship remained strained, he'd stopped referring to me as the family failure. Danny had shaped up significantly after receiving his own lease violation notice. Becoming one of the building's most respectful tenants, my parents had undergone the most interesting transformation. The initial shock of discovering their unsuccessful son owned their building had evolved into a grudging respect for my business acumen. Dad started asking for investment advice, and Mom began introducing me to her friends as my son, the real estate investor. But it was Jennifer who surprised me most. She knocked on my apartment door one evening in late summer, holding a bottle of wine and wearing an expression I'd never seen before. Humility, can we talk? She asked. We sat on my balcony overlooking the harbor. The same view she'd once described with such pride from her own apartment, 3 floors below. I owe you an apology, she said directly. Not just for calling you broke, but for years of treating you like you didn't know what you were doing. Jennifer, you don't have to. Yes, I do. I was the golden child who thought success only looked one way. I couldn't see that you were building something different because it didn't match my definition of achievement. She took a sip of wine and continued. You know what really bothers me? I'm a lawyer. I'm supposed to be good at analyzing evidence and drawing logical conclusions. But I completely missed the evidence that you were becoming wealthy and successful. To be fair, I was hiding it pretty well. You were hiding it because we made you feel like you had to. We created an environment where your accomplishments didn't count unless they looked like our accomplishments. I thought about all the family gatherings where I'd felt like an outsider. All the times my dreams had been dismissed as unrealistic fantasies. You know what's funny? I bought this building partly to prove you all wrong, but now that I own it, I realize I don't need your validation anymore. Jennifer nodded slowly. That's probably the healthiest thing you've ever said about our family. We talked for another 2 hours about childhood dynamics, parental favoritism, and the ways families can unconsciously damage each other while trying to help. It was the most honest conversation we'd ever had. Are you going to renew my lease? She asked, as she prepared to leave. Do you want me to? Yes, but not because I'm your sister. Because I'm a good tenant who pays rent on time and follows building policies. Then yes, I'll renew your lease because you're a good tenant who pays rent on time and follows building policies. Asterisk, as I watched her walk to the elevator, I realized something important had shifted. For the first time in our relationship, we were treating each other as equals rather than as golden child and disappointment. My cryptocurrency investment had given me wealth, but owning my family's building had given me something more valuable. The confidence to define my own worth instead of accepting their definition of my value. Thanksgiving 2019 looked very different from the previous year. We gathered again in Jennifer's apartment, but the family dynamics had fundamentally changed. I was no longer the struggling relative they worried about. I was the successful businessman they asked for advice. Asterisk, The conversation flowed differently too. Instead of awkward silences when someone asked about my work, I had legitimate business updates to share. Grandview Towers had been profitable for 6 straight months. I'd purchased 2 additional properties, and my investment portfolio had grown to over $12 million. But more importantly, the relationships felt healthier. Dad asked thoughtful questions about property management and seemed genuinely interested in my answers. Mom talked about her new hobby of researching real estate trends, inspired by my success. Even Uncle Robert, who had visited for the first time since moving out, treated me with the respect that felt authentic rather than obligatory. "Marcus," he said during dessert, "I want to apologize for how I handled the situation with Rex. You were right to enforce the lease policies. I was being entitled and dishonest. I appreciate that, Uncle Robert. How are you settling in at the new place? Good, really good. The apartment allows pets, and Maria loves having the yard access for Rex. It's actually a better fit for us. Jennifer raised her wine glass. I'd like to propose a toast to Marcus, who taught us all that success comes in many forms, and that we should never underestimate the quiet ones who are busy changing their lives. Here, Dad said, raising his glass. After dinner, I walked out onto Jennifer's balcony and looked up at my own apartment windows 3 floors above. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. I'd literally risen above their expectations. Both financially and emotionally, my phone buzzed with a text from Janet at Premier Property Management. New tenant application for Unit 1203. Young couple, excellent credit, no pets. Should I approve? I typed back, yes. Approve it. Uncle Robert's old unit deserves tenants who follow the rules. The next message was from my financial advisor. Bitcoin hit new all-time high today. Your remaining crypto holdings are now worth $4.2 million, ready to diversify into more real estate? I smiled and put the phone away. 6 months ago, I would have obsessively checked cryptocurrency prices and worried about market volatility. Now I understood that true wealth wasn't just about accumulating assets. It was about building the confidence to make decisions without seeking approval from people who'd never believed in your vision. Inside the apartment, I could hear my family's laughter, warm and inclusive in a way that had never included me before. But the difference now was that I didn't need their inclusion to feel valuable. I'd learned to value myself. The family that once called me broke now lived in buildings I owned. The relatives who'd worried about my future now asked for investment advice. The brother they'd seen as a failure had become someone they respected. But the most important transformation wasn't how they saw me, was how I'd learned to see myself. I was no longer Marcus the disappointment, or Marcus the family failure. I was simply Marcus, real estate investor, cryptocurrency, early adopter, and successful businessman, who happened to be related to his tenants. And that was exactly who I'd always been, even when they couldn't see it.